Hello, I'm Drew Gibson. Welcome to this special edition of Faith, Hope and Sport. I used to teach at Union Theological College in Belfast, and recently they asked if I'd be interested in contributing to their in-house podcast. The episode of the UTC podcast that I was involved in is simply called A Theology of Sport, and you can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean and Amazon Music, or through the college's social media. The folk at UTC have kindly made this podcast available to me to share with you. I'm chatting with Professor Michael McClenaghan and Dr. Graham Shearer about how we can enjoy sport in a way that's consistent with being a thoughtful follower of Jesus Christ. And here it is.
Great to be here today with my old friend, Drew Gibson, and my colleague on faculty, Graham Shearer. And we're here today to talk about sport and theology. So, Drew, why don't you start by telling us just a little bit about yourself, how you got to be where you are today?
Yeah, I'm a Belfast native, born and bred, although for 6 years I lived with my wife in Kenya, which was a life-changing thing, by the way, but I'll not drift down that road. Well, I could drift down that road for a second. I did play one game of football in Kenya, in which I played for the first 5 minutes, ran down the wing, pulled a muscle, and that was it.
Well, they still talk about that in Kenya, do they?
They still talk about it. No, I grew up in Belfast, school in Hollywood, went to Queen's University, then to Union College. And then I was ordained in 1981. I've been a Presbyterian minister ever since.
And you served here on faculty?
Yeah, I served for 15 years on faculty here from 2006 until 2021.
Was it really that? Really 2021?
It was 2021. It's 5 years since I retired, and it just seems like yesterday.
In new COVID times?
Retired during COVID. So, yeah, I went out with a whimper rather than a bang, I think is probably the best way of putting it.
So, Drew, tell us about this podcast that started this year, Faith, Hope and Sport. What's been the plan with that?
I've been thinking about sports for many, many years, and I've written lots of essays just for my own enjoyment, contributed a few articles to books and so on. I think I'm concerned about sport because it takes such a big place in many people's lives. And I thought recently, maybe about a year ago, if I'm not going to actually put all this stuff into a book, what's the best thing I could do with it? And I've been involved with commission radio for many years. And we suggested a podcast. And I've blatantly stolen some words for the title from no less a person than St. Paul. In 1 Corinthians 13, these three abide: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest is love. Well, for my people, faith and hope really should have been completed by sport because they love sport so deeply. So I thought, if I can bring some sort of Christian perspective on how people think about sport, then it'll be helpful for Christians, I hope. And maybe in the broader community, it'll be helpful for people to think more wisely about sport.
So what kind of issues have you been covering so far?
Well, I've interviewed 4 people so far, 2 from a footballing background, one from Queen's, Gladys Gagnon, who is a professor at Queen's, but also a marathon runner, one of the top marathon runners in the province. In the next one, I'll be starting a little series of either 2 or 3 on sport in the Bible. I spoke with Desi Alexander about the Old Testament and with Gordon Campbell about the New Testament. So it's looking at sport in people's lives, looking at sport scripturally, and then I do a little extra piece at the end of each podcast that I call Extra Time. And that's where I look at a specific issue that has come up in sport. So when I spoke with Gladys, the idea of sport and reconciliation in Northern Ireland came up. So I did an extra 10 minutes on that.
You mentioned looking at what the Bible has to say about sport. Many people think not a huge number of references to sport in as they read through the scriptures. What kind of material have been uncovering that relates to sport in the Bible?
Well, I think it was Desi Alexander and Gordon Ampett as well, who pushed a line of thinking for me. I started by asking the question, what has the Bible say about sport? You look at the Old Testament and you think, nothing much, apart from a few old jokes about Joseph serving in the courts of Pharaoh. But that doesn't really cut the mustard, I don't think. And then in the New Testament, you have St. Paul using sport a couple of times. He talks about running a race, and he talks about boxing, talks about winning a crown. But my conversation with Gordon also put that into a bit of perspective, particularly looking not at Paul this time, but at Hebrews, where we're told about us as Christians surrounded by a crowd or cloud of witnesses. And that's often interpreted to mean being in an athletic stadium surrounded by a crowd, whereas really that's not the case. So we can find a few references to sport, but the other way of looking at it is not to say where is sport in the Bible, but what is the Bible to teach me about how I look at sport, about how I play sport, about how I support a sports team. And that's much more interesting. And that's where we say, well, there's just huge amounts of material in Scripture that will guide how we think about sport.
And what do you see as sort of key ideas, key principles then?
Yeah, I would think if I had to choose one, there are many, of course. If I had to choose one, it's seeing sport as rest. And I think that has been decimated over the years. Sport is what's sometimes called autotelic activity. In other words, it has no meaning outside itself. If you think of 22 guys trying to kick a ball in between two posts so it hits a net, well, what's that about? Or 30 guys with a funny shaped ball trying to put it on the far side of a white line. It's meaningless. It doesn't have any meaning at all. Outside itself, inside itself has meaning, but outside itself there's no meaning. And if you contrast that with work has meaning inside itself and outside itself. So you work to raise crops, you work to design buildings, you work to teach children, and all of those are meaningful activities. So when we engage in sport, we are resting from that work. And theologically, that goes back to creation, because God has built into creation this movement between work and rest. And we have, as you know, 16th narrative of creation, and 7th as rest. And the 7th, if you like, almost being the high point of the week. And again, obviously we have seen worship on Sunday or on the Old Testament Sabbath as being the high point of creation. And that is absolutely right. Provocative little thought to see rest as the high point of creation, which includes worship, which is defined by worship, and in which sport has its little part to play.
So you mentioned that has begun to be lost.
Yes.
How do you see that being lost in the world of sport?
Let me just deal with contemporary sport. You can go back and look at this historically, because sport has always had awful associations to it. But in the contemporary world, it's the professionalization of sport. Can I approach this from a little bit of a roundabout direction? If you think of a spectrum, at one end of that spectrum you have rest, and at the other end of the spectrum you have work. Human activity can fall somewhere along that spectrum. So you have rest, which is most fully seen in sleeping. You have recreational activity, so reading a book, watching a film. As you become more active, you maybe start to play a game. And as that game becomes a bit more organized, then it becomes a sport. So you have an organizational group, you have rules, you have books, you have all sorts of things going on. And then as that sport becomes more intense, it can cross over into being work. And that's your professional sports person. And I have no problem with that. There's no reason why a person shouldn't make a living playing football, just as they might painting a painting or acting in a play. But there's a gray area when sport for the amateur becomes so serious that it becomes work. I'm thinking here of the American collegiate football. I'm also thinking of the fifth and sixth forms in some schools in Ireland with respect to their rugby. And I've heard a number of folks say, not he gave up rugby after school. He was brilliant, but he was so fed up with it because it had become work. And when that happens, something dies within sport. Something that ought to be a pleasure has drifted over into work. There's no payment for it.
Andrew, probably one of the marks of that is that historically, people who were good at sport were good at more than one.
Yes, that's right.
And they could turn their hand, and we played seasonal sports. So even at school in the old days, we played rugby or hockey in the wintertime or football. We played cricket and tennis in the summer. And it was nearly always the same people who were best at everything. People played multiple sports.
Yes.
And I think one of the downsides of early professionalization is that people are made to play one sport and they don't get the benefits of playing, the different kinds of sports that are available to them. There's a difference between playing doubles tennis and playing rugby, all sorts of differences. Drew, can I ask you a question about theological virtues and watching sport? So what supporting watching sport does to us as viewers? Because obviously, most of our listeners will know that we're all former elite athletes.
In our imagination.
In our imaginations. But now we've moved from elite athletic contribution to a more sedentary approach to sport. It strikes me as really ironic that you can go to a football match and the people on the pitch are governed by really strict sets of rules, and everything they do is being recorded and played back. And now we have the nightmare of VAR, second guessing the referee. And people on the pitch are expected to behave in a certain way. But if you go to any football terrace and watch a football match, particularly if it's local football in Northern Ireland, what you hear from the terrace is about as far away from what's expected on the pitch as you can imagine. So you've got this huge disjunction between what we expect of the people on the pitch now and what's expected of the people in the stands. Talk to us a little bit just about what's happening to us when we follow sport, how we can be good followers of the teams that we enjoy watching.
Yeah, I would certainly come very close to and maybe actually say that sport is a bigger problem for fans than it is for players. The first time I noticed this, in fact, the first thing I ever wrote about sport was I had just conducted a funeral in Dundonald Cemetery. And I noticed on the way back to the car a headstone with a Manchester United logo on it. And I thought to myself, what's going on here? Why did this man or this man's family think Manchester United was so important to him that its logo had to be on the headstone? And for me, the biggest problem with being a football fan or a fan of any sport is that it starts to determine one's identity. There it was on the headstone. And there were many headstones like that. You also see it in things like tattoos. Quite common now to have sporting tattoos, enormous tattoos on a calf or on the chest or wherever. A particularly sad way of seeing it is in the naming of children named after your sports heroes. In fact, on a few occasions, people have named their child after the whole team. So the child's had 11 names. And the one particular case I remember is where a man named his child after the Liverpool first team. And the child was a girl. You think, what on earth are you doing? So I think there's a bigger problem with fandom. So how do I think of being a fan theologically? I think worship is the key thing here. And along with worship is identity. So what am I doing on a Saturday afternoon if I'm standing on a terrace? Well, you can see superficial similarities with worship. I may be singing. I may be Pentecostal and hold my hands up in the air at an appropriate moment when everything gets exciting. I may even indulge in prayer when somebody's taking a penalty at a crucial point of the game. And so you can see superficial parallels with worship. There's also another little bit of a parallel with the idea of transcendence. Again, I don't want to push this too far. Some people have pushed it too far. When you're involved in sport, playing or watching, you're entering a different world, a world that in a sense is bigger than yourself. Now, in Christian worship, when we gather together, we're doing something similar, especially in the sacraments. We are touching a reality that sort of lies in the background of our lives for the rest of our lives. As sport begins to take that place, something bad is going on.
There's a really interesting crossover, I think. I'm going to ask you both for an example of a sporting experience when you've seen in sport live that has really affected you. But I think for me, without question, it was the 1995 FA Cup final at the Old Wembley. Manchester United playing against Everton, and Manchester United managed to lose that, which was disastrous. But the thing that moved me, and I still think about it often, was the singing of Abide With Me by this enormous crowd of football fans, and this huge crowd singing Hold My Thy Cross before my dying eyes. And that, it's not for me to judge how authentic that was at a moment for tens of thousands of people singing it. But for me, I mean, I cried, and because I didn't have the means to process this sort of sporting event that I was heavily invested in. And then suddenly my faith, which is so much more important than sport, suddenly cutting right across it. And then the cross itself being exalted. Yes. And those crossovers between worship and spirituality and sport are actually quite hard for people. They're quite hard for people to work out what's going on. You know, the young person who sees their sporting hero crossing himself or getting down to pray after scoring, trying to work out, you know, what kind of ritual am I watching here?
I think ritual's a good word, because sport involves a lot of rituals, and worship involves a lot of rituals, and rituals can be actually pretty good things. Although in our Presbyterian tradition, we tend not to think of it like that, but they can. But as you suggest, when you get that crossover between rituals, it can be really very confusing. If you want a moment from me that stands out in sport, it's in Lyon, when Northern Ireland were playing in the European finals 10 years ago, and being there with friends I had known since early teenage years, and that friendship has been mediated through sport. We played football together. We played football in the park together. We played table tennis and all sorts of things together. And then at this great passionate moment, with the crowd singing, and I'm there with all my friends. It was wonderful.
So the communion of the saints, isn't it?
Communion of the saints, that works for me.
Yeah. What about you?
I think it has to be cricket, and it would be the last day of the England versus West Indies 5th Test in 2000. The West Indies had a very good team, and they were just on the decline. But England hadn't beaten them since, I think, the early 70s at that point. And on the 5th day, you could get in for, I think it was 10 quid or something. And I got there pretty early, but the ground was absolutely packed. They were opening up hospitality boxes because no one had seen England win. A year ago, they'd been the worst Test team in the world at that point, and England had to bowl the West Indies out, and Brian Lara was batting at one point, and I managed to watch him practice about a few feet away from him, but eventually the England bowling attack, which I won't name at this point, but the England bowling attack was able to prevail. And in those days, at the end of a test match, everyone ran onto the pitch. And so as soon as the last wicket fell, might have been Courtney Walsh or someone like that, all the crowd just poured onto the pitch. Of course, you'd love to be able to nick one of the fielders' caps or something like that. I didn't quite get close enough for that, but that was a great day. I really enjoyed that. It was, there was a kind of sense of historic occasion and a sense that, everyone was being part of something that everyone was watching and engaged with. So yeah, that would be it.
Michael, can I come back to a question that you asked earlier and that I drifted away from? And that was the virtues of sport, or the goods of sport, or the values of sport. People often tend to assume that sport normally produces good things. And the classic example is teamwork. Every team needs to work well as a team. That's great. Another example would be physical fitness, and that's great as well. I prefer to see sport as a carrier for things. It could be a carrier for good teamwork, a carrier for physical fitness, but it can also carry other things. I suppose the one that stands out for me is Thierry Henry's handball against Ireland many years ago. They got France through to the World Cup and knocked Ireland out. Blatant. And commentators divided into two: those who really were angry with him, and those who said, well, that's what you do. You get away with it, you do it. So sport can help us to learn good things, but it can also help us to learn evil things as well. It can teach us how to cheat well. Or teamwork, again, generally think of it as a good thing. But it takes good teamwork perhaps to rob a bank. And that's maybe not quite so good. So sport can carry good things, can carry evil things. And the decision has to be made by everybody who is a fan or who takes part in sport or who is an administrator. What are we going to promote here? How are we going to be as a club, as a set of fans? And that is a decision that isn't always made in the best way.
It strikes me what you're saying there. You mentioned sport being autotelic, which I had another word I was familiar with, but that self an end in itself. But it strikes me that in our society now, that's increasingly less the case, in the sense that sport is based, and we were seeing with this World Cup, and obviously that's been true of many World Cups prior to this, that it's a vehicle for commercial interests. It's a vehicle to promote that soft drink or that. I mean, everyone's been laughing about the Saudi oil business, Aramco, being able to say, what am I going to go out and buy a barrel of crude oil now that I've seen that on the side of the pitch? But the sport is actually a vehicle for it. It's being used as a bait to draw people in, because they think, I might have that transcendent experience of watching my team win. I might have that. We all remember those great moments of watching the TV or being in the ground when, yes, do you remember that? But then actually it's a 0-0 draw against Ghana and it's an incredibly boring game.
But I still bought the barrel of oil. So
well, exactly. That's the thing. You still ordered Domino's pizza, and you still bought your beer and everything.
And this World Cup, you still had your hydration breaks.
I mean,
an extra long half time.
Yeah.
Appetizers.
It strikes me that that's how that says something about our society, that, as you said, we don't have capacity to have things that are in and of themselves, don't have capacity to have things that are real, true rest. There's always a private equity fund that's highly leveraged, that's got to get a return on its investment. And so, I mean, you're seeing this in cricket in particular, with the way counties are getting bought out and so on and so forth. I just wonder how you analyze that. What do you think is driving that? Why are we now in that situation? Whereas, decades before, it seemed natural to start the FA Cup final with a hymn about the cost of prize. What's the shift?
I think it's partly the secularization process that's been going on for such a long time in Western society. But there's more to it than that. I talked about sport as a carrier, and it always has been a carrier, right back to the very beginning. It was a carrier for religious activities back in the Greek and Roman era. And my, in inverted commas, favorite example of that is a South American sport that was close to basketball. It was part of a religious ceremony.
Right.
And the losing team,
I think I've seen pictures of
they were decapitated and offered to the gods.
Yeah.
So it always had those associations and commercial associations.
Which certainly incentivized the team to after it, wasn't it?
No. But again, commercial associations have always been there. Advertising has always been there. And I think as society, well, in my personal opinion, becomes more meaningless than commerciality. Is that a word?
Commercialism.
Commercialism.
Yeah.
Commercialism becomes more important.
Yeah.
I think it's a question of degree rather than kind, and it is disruptive. It's destructive. I think, was it 1928 I have heard of as the key year, certainly in the 20s, when the Western world, at least, say Europe and North America, passed a point. Roughly before that point, people engaged in work and in advertising in particular in order to sell stuff that was important. And they were producing in order to meet needs. But after the mid-20s, we became so efficient in producing stuff that we could more than meet our needs. And so the advertising industry became not so much about saying, my soap powder is better than your soap powder, but it became about producing demand, not meeting demand.
Well, I mean, there's a book called Propaganda by Edward Bernays, who's Sigmund Freud's nephew, where he basically says this. He says, if we can't keep these factories turning over, we're going to have an economic crash. So you've got to, he's basically pitching the public relations business to the kind of captains of commerce, saying, you need me to use my psychological techniques to generate these unmeetable needs that then will keep the factories turning. And of course, the Wall Street crash kind of vindicated that analysis, because that's exactly what happened. People didn't need another fridge, so they didn't buy one because the stock market crashed. And so I think that's exactly right.
And sports now caught up in that in huge ways. And that's destructive for everybody.
Yeah.
Well, if you've taken out a contract on a player to play baseball at $50 million a year for the next 10 years, someone's got to generate the cash. And
I found out recently, along the same lines, Michael, the most expensive TV rights in the world, probably no surprise, NFL in the United States. It's the second most expensive that really struck me as Indian Premier League cricket.
Oh, yeah.
So you have huge amounts of money being spent on televised sport in India, where a significant number of people struggle to.
I think in the interest of transparency, we should probably say at this point that this podcast, the Union podcast, we're currently in negotiations about the third, fourth place playoff in the World Cup, the hydration break in the first half. And so I think if our listeners hear us, speaking about these commercial sensitivities, we just need to be upfront and say they may actually, if they tune in for that match, pick us up in that third, fourth playoff. And we're really hoping that we can.
All 6 people watching will be. We'll see how.
Well, of course, the next step is for ministers to have on the front of their clerical shirt the name of the local butcher.
Well, I did hear one well-known preacher say that he felt on the back of his Geneva gown he should have the Nike tick.
Yes.
The slogan was just do it. As we used to at the end of the service after benediction, just announce the benediction and then turn 180 degrees, and the message to the congregation would be just do it. Drew, maybe you can say a little bit about the history of sport. I'm certainly not in any way an expert on the academic literature. There must be a literature on the history of sport. Sport's changed a lot since the 19th century, but clearly sport has always been. And those of us who enjoy sport we would have kicked a stone around in the 1300s. And there are always ways in which people were able to play. And so could you say a little bit about that? Is for example, one of the reasons why there's not much sport in the Bible, because it was just assumed. I mean, there's not a lot about a lot of things in the Bible because human existence is just assumed. And is that just one of those things that it's just assumed that people were playful, people were swimming, people were climbing, people were running, people were kicking things around forever because that's just what it is to be human?
Yes.
Any thoughts on that?
Yes. I would probably make a bit of a distinction between three things. That's playing, games, and sport. So playing has always been around. It's in every child's life. It's throughout human history, people have played in all sorts of different ways, sometimes physically robust play, sometimes playing, say, card games or Monopoly or whatever. When that play becomes a bit more organized, it becomes a game. And again, games have been around for a long time. So when I was with my friends in Orangefield Park, 6:30 on a summer evening, 4 of us there kicking a ball about. And then somebody else came along and they got involved. And somebody else. And gradually you maybe had 40 people playing that game when it was too dark to see the ball. So play and games have always been around. Sport as a specifically organized thing is much harder to identify. When does a game become a sport? When does my kicking the ball about in the park become a sport? It's when it becomes organized. So you're right. It's always been there in one form or another, even if it's not in a well-structured book of rules, organized form. I want to come back again to that idea of play. And if we think of play theologically, you can think of who is God? What does God do? And it sounds really weird to say it, but it's provocative. Does God work or does God play? Now, I know in Genesis, in the creation narrative, God is seen to be working and then resting on the Sabbath. Well, what does that mean? When we think of work, we think of something that's necessary, that you have to do to keep on living, essentially. Play isn't necessary. So does God need to work? Does God have to do stuff in order to keep on existing? Well, surely not. Surely he doesn't have to do that. So that might lead us to say that everything that God does can be considered in a very loose way or in a very narrow way, if I can use both of those, to be play. It's things that are done without necessity. If we then move to incarnation, as God takes on human flesh, then what's going on there? Well, we know that Jesus grew up as the child of a carpenter. Presumably he became a carpenter in his early teenage years, probably. So he worked in that sense. We also, I think, are right in saying that Jesus' work of salvation is properly described as a work. It was a necessary thing to do that required commitment. But then again, we can ask the same question. Was it absolutely necessary for Jesus to come to the earth? Could God the Father, if you like, in discussion with the Son and the Spirit, said, let's just end this. Let's finish it all. Well, he could have, but chose not to. If we think of the categories of work and play, and we think of the nature of God and the process of salvation, the categories of work and play simply break down. They don't apply.
And John Ruskin talks about this a lot as work because he reacted against the industrialization of human work and the need to reestablish man as artisan, that man is artist. when he works. And
Yes.
so to some extent, he's both playing and working at the same time. And I mean, it's the only way to give any responsible account of the created order is that God delights in the work of his own hands, because there's so much about creation that doesn't appear to have any particular function. It's either just beautiful or amusing.
Yes.
And we just need to look. And Ruskin said that if he could get Darwin to look at a feather for 1 hour, his entire theory would fall apart.
C.S. Lewis has a quote, and it always gets, in modern versions, it gets edited, but it's something along the lines of modern biology makes animals seem as if they're as efficient as Germans. And that national stereotype is often excised from the modern version. But whereas actually when you look at an animal, you realize they just spend loads of time just kind of splashing about, do whatever they want to do. They're not kind of always sort of driven by this drive for efficiency and so on. They actually do just kind of frolic and enjoy.
Well, there was a great video just a few weeks ago on the BBC of tigers from a drone showing that we always thought that tigers were solitary animals, and then they suddenly found these tigers just hanging out shooting the breeze together, and they do it where nobody else can see them. And so we've only now seen it for the first time in drone footage, and suddenly we're like, okay, so apparently tigers have parties, so we didn't know anything about it. So there's so much about the created order that God is not trying to be efficient in what he's made. He's creating something that reflects the beauty of his own glory.
And the comment about Ruskin and industrialization, I think, is significant, because as I understand it, when you look at the kind of formation of sport, football league clubs, codification of rules, there's this kind of massive, across all sports, football, rugby, cricket, it all happens in kind of mid to late 19th century. There are teams as Hamilton Cricket Club in the 18th century and stuff, but when it really starts getting organized and codified in the way you mentioned about sport, it seems to happen in the context where work has become this kind of industrialized, highly efficient process. And then you need something that is a release. And, I think there was kind of government reforms, which meant that working men had Saturdays off. So they had an extra day off.
Saturday afternoons initially, which is right.
Yes, right.
They work Saturday morning and they got Saturday afternoons.
Yes.
And so that then creates these social structures where you need something that is not the endless grind of work.
Mm-hmm.
But it's ironic then that category which is created, which was, we're just going to have time to kick a ball around or go and watch our the people same live in the same town, same community as we do, kind of do something for us. That category has sort of then been eaten up by the endless kind of rapacity of work and needing to. So it strikes me, sports kind of failed in its original intention to provide us with that kind of play, with that kind of rest that it was initially designed to achieve.
Yeah, I think that's right. And once you take the playfulness out of work, then work becomes destructive and or can become destructive and needs to be replaced. And if sport and lots of other leisure activities, you think of the full range of leisure activities, if they're not doing that, then there's a bit of a downward spiral.
It's interesting how all these things cycle across each other in terms of work and play. A few years ago, seeing a video of one of these international gaming conventions in South Korea.
Yes.
And there were sort of 75,000 people in an arena watching 3 people playing, some weird online game. And, my natural middle-aged cynicism, that's not sport. And they just need to get off their computers. They need to go do something useful. But it turns out, people who can fly drones are going to save Western civilization. and what began as a sport from computer programming became computer games is now crossed over now into military application, which, everything we thought we knew about fighting wars is now ended because we now all need to be able to fly drones. And it's interesting the way these things just cycle over each other, all these categories of work and play and rest. Historically, we get them confused or they have new applications.
Mm-hmm.
Well, archery is now sports, isn't it? If someone says I'm an archer, that you'd assume they're doing it for sport, whereas it was kind of basically a national defence strategy.
But one of my temptations when I was talking with Desi about sport in the Old Testament was to look at David and Jonathan, where Jonathan goes out into the field with his bow and arrow and says to the servant, "I put beyond you," and David knows then.
Yeah.
That's significant. What was Jonathan doing there? Tempting to say, well, he was playing. It was a bit of sport in the Old Testament. But of course, he was practicing so that he could be a good archer from the point of view of war.
Yes.
Drew, we've appreciated this conversation today. We're going to have to draw it to a close quite soon. I do want to ask you, though, all natural limitations to one side, is there a sport that wasn't prominent when you were growing up that is now prominent that you think to yourself, I'd love to have a go at that. I've never really had a go. Gosh, that looks like a great new sport.
In terms of new sports, I can sort of answer that. In East Belfast on the Holywood Road, they're just building a new paddle stadium. And paddle has only come on to the scene in the last few years. And I thought, give that a go. It looks like a nice sort of restful thing, not too much effort, something that somebody of my age could do. I might enjoy that. And it has an innocence to it. But of course, even though it's a new kid on the block, it now has sponsors, international championships, prize money. You think, leave it alone. But I would still like to have a wee go at it.
Drew, thank you for your time today. Thank you, Graham, for joining us.
I hope you enjoyed that. Many thanks to the folks at Union Theological College for allowing us to share it with you on Faith, Hope and Sport. The original and the college's other podcasts can be found at UTC Podcast, which you can find on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean and Amazon Music, or through the college's website and social media. I'll be back soon with the next episode of Faith, Hope and Sport. Until then, goodbye.